It was a routine traffic stop. At least, that's what the officers thought. But when they pulled over an elderly black man, their assumptions would soon come crashing down. What started as a simple arrest spiraled into something far more explosive. The officers, with their racial bias on full display, treated him as though he was guilty of something before he even spoke. They didn't see him as a person, just another victim of their prejudice. But this wasn't just any man. This was someone who had lived through decades of injustice, someone who knew exactly what to do when pushed to the edge. The elderly man remained calm, despite the insults and aggressive questioning. And then he did something no one expected. He made one phone call, a call that would change everything. With the phone pressed to his ear, he dialed the one number that could shake the foundation of their world, the Supreme Court. As the tension grew, so did the stakes. What could this man possibly have up his sleeve? What would happen when the highest authority in the land was brought into this shocking encounter? Stay tuned to find out how this simple phone call turned the tables in a way no one saw coming. The officers were still processing the situation, unsure of how to handle the man who remained eerily calm despite the hostilities surrounding him. His name was James Carter, a retired history teacher who had lived through the turbulent civil rights era. He wasn't someone who was easily intimidated, and he certainly wasn't going to let his dignity be stripped away by officers who thought they could get away with mistreating him. For James, this wasn't just about the traffic stop. This was about something much bigger, a legacy of systemic racism that had long gone unchecked. As the officers debated among themselves, James' fingers slowly dialed the number he had memorized for years. The sound of the phone ringing seemed to echo through the quiet street, adding to the tension of the moment. The officers barely noticed. They were too busy trying to figure out their next move. One of them looked at James with a smug grin, assuming he was just stalling for time. But that grin soon faded as the conversation on the other end of the line began to take shape. James wasn't just calling any lawyer or local official. He was calling a connection deep within the highest court in the land. The wheels of justice were about to start turning in a way no one expected. What was he going to say? What was going to happen next? It wasn't just a call, it was a declaration. And the officers had no idea just how far this was about to go. James stood there, his back straight, his eyes unwavering, as the phone call continued on the other end. The officers, growing restless, glanced at each other, their initial arrogance starting to fade. They hadn't expected a man like James to be so composed under pressure, and it unsettled them. One of the officers, younger and eager to prove himself, began pacing, eyeing James suspiciously as though waiting for him to make a wrong move. But James didn't flinch. He knew this moment was bigger than any of them realized. It wasn't just his rights at stake. It was the legacy of every person who had been wronged in the name of racism and injustice. The call was taking longer than the officers had anticipated. They whispered among themselves, unsure how to proceed. Was this some kind of stunt, a game? Or was James actually serious about invoking the highest power in the land? In the back of their minds, they had doubts. This wasn't something that happened every day, but they refused to show it. Their pride and authority were on the line. One officer, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up, his voice laced with disdain. "Let's just cuff him already. He's wasting our time." But James didn't move. His calm demeanor was beginning to rattle them, pushing them into a corner. The minutes dragged on, each second building the tension even more. On the other side of the phone, James was connected to someone who had the ear of a justice in Washington, someone who knew the inner workings of the legal system like the back of their hand. The call was no accident. James had been preparing for this moment his whole life. But what exactly was he hoping to achieve? Was this really just a matter of righting a wrong, or was he about to unleash something much larger, something that could send shockwaves through the system? The officer pacing nervously finally turned to his partner, eyes narrowing in frustration. "Who does he think he is?" he muttered, not realizing that his words were now part of the growing storm. James, however, had heard it all, and as he remained on the line, he understood the stakes more clearly than anyone else. It wasn't just about what happened here, on this street. This was about the years of silence, the countless stories that had been ignored. James wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for every person who had ever been wronged by the system. And soon the world was going to know. But for now, the tension hung thick in the air, leaving everyone to wonder what James' next move would be. The officers grew more restless with each passing minute. The one who had suggested handcuffing James was now visibly frustrated, his jaw tight, eyes darting back and forth, unsure of how to assert control over the situation. The older officer, the one who had remained quiet at first, finally spoke, his voice lower and tinged with a hint of doubt. "We should just let him go. This is getting out of hand," he muttered, but the younger officer wasn't ready to back down. He was determined to prove a point, to remind James who held the power here. The tension between them was palpable, and it only made the situation worse. James stood as a silent, unmovable figure, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around him. On the other end of the line, the conversation had shifted. James could hear the urgency in the voice of the person on the other side. "Mr. Carter, you know what you're asking. This isn't a small matter. You're about to shake things up in a way that could change everything," they said. But James wasn't backing down. He had fought for justice his entire life, and this was the moment to make his stand, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been unjustly treated. The officers could feel the pressure mounting. Every passing second felt like a countdown, and they were caught in the middle of something far bigger than they could comprehend. They had no idea what was happening on that phone call, but they knew it wasn't good for them. One officer moved toward James, trying to regain control, but James held up his hand, a silent command that stopped him in his tracks. The phone call was nearly over. James' words were measured, deliberate. The officers could only watch, helpless, as their own authority seemed to slip away, piece by piece. With every word James spoke, the inevitability of something huge unfolding grew clearer. The quiet before the storm was almost unbearable. What had James said on that phone? And what was about to happen next? The sound of footsteps in the distance broke the silence. A car pulling up, the crunch of gravel under tires. But it wasn't just any car. James' call had set things in motion. The officers had no idea who was arriving, but it didn't matter. The moment they had feared was arriving fast. The car's engine rolled to a stop, and the officers turned instinctively, their hands hovering near their holsters, unsure of what was coming next. From the distance, they could see the silhouette of a figure emerging from the vehicle, a tall, imposing figure dressed in dark clothing. At first, they assumed it was just another local official, perhaps someone sent to handle the situation. But as the person stepped into the light, their faces dropped in disbelief. It wasn't anyone from the local police force. It wasn't anyone they recognized at all. The newcomer was a woman, mid-30s, her expression cold and determined. She walked with purpose, had every step radiating authority. She approached the officers, and without even acknowledging their presence, she turned directly toward James. The officers' confusion turned to concern. Who was she? How did she know James? And why did it feel like she was in charge? "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice clear, unwavering. "I'm here to make sure this ends now." The officers exchanged glances, their unease growing. The situation had escalated in ways they couldn't understand. But before they could respond, the woman pulled out a badge, a federal badge, the kind they only saw in high-profile cases. "Who the hell are you?" one officer demanded, his voice sharp with authority. But the woman didn't flinch. "I'm with the Department of Justice. I'm here because of that call you've been ignoring," she said, her eyes locked on James. "And if you don't stand down, there will be consequences. Big ones." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the officers were paralyzed. They had thought they were in control of the situation, but now they realized they were just pawns in something far bigger, something they had no control over. They had no idea what James had unleashed with that call, but now it seemed the consequences were rolling in fast and hard. The woman turned to the officers, her gaze never leaving them. "This ends now. Step aside." The officers were stunned. What was going on? Why was the Department of Justice involved? What had James done? Every second of the standoff felt like a ticking time bomb, and the tension crackled with anticipation. The woman's presence alone made it clear. This was far from a simple case of police overreach. There was something much deeper, something that could change everything. James stood silently, his face unreadable, but his eyes told a different story. He had known this moment would come. This was just the beginning. The officers, still reeling from the sudden appearance of the federal agent, were left with no choice but to step back. Their faces betrayed a mix of confusion, anger, and fear, but the woman's authority was undeniable. As they hesitated, James looked at her with quiet appreciation, knowing exactly why she was there. He'd made the call, but he hadn't expected it to go this far. Still, he'd known there was a bigger game at play. The system wasn't just broken, it was corrupted to its core, and if this moment could expose that, it was worth any risk. The woman flashed a look at the officers, her tone sharp. "You've overstepped," she said, her voice cutting through the tense air. "You've violated his rights, and now you'll face the consequences." Her words were heavy, but she wasn't done. She turned to James, her expression softening. "This won't be easy. You're about to stir up a storm that no one will be able to ignore." The younger officer finally spoke, his voice trembling. "What's going on here? Why is she involved?" James didn't flinch. "She's here because the law can't protect people like me, not when it's this corrupt. But it's about time that changes. This is bigger than just one arrest. This is about standing up to a system that's broken." Just as the officer opened his mouth to protest, something unexpected happened. A loud, shrill sound broke the tension. Another car, but this time it was not a government vehicle. The officers turned quickly to see several more cars pulling up, this time with cameras, reporters, and bystanders who had gathered the moment they'd heard about the altercation. The word was out. The streets were no longer quiet. The story was spreading faster than anyone could control. The woman, still standing firm, let out a deep breath. "We need to move quickly. There's a lot of work to do, but this is just the beginning." James nodded, his expression resolute. "This is where the change starts," he said quietly, his voice carrying weight. As the federal agent turned to speak with the arriving crowd, the officers were left standing there powerless. They realized, too late, that this was no longer a situation they could control. This wasn't just about a routine arrest or a routine day for them. It was the start of a larger reckoning. They had become the face of something far more dangerous than they ever imagined. But just as the agents and reporters began to encircle the scene, one of the officers, frustrated and desperate, reached for his radio. "We need backup. Now." The words were a last-ditch attempt to salvage some semblance of order. But as he spoke, something even more unexpected happened. His radio crackled, and a voice he hadn't anticipated filled the airways. "This is Sergeant Wallace. I'm here to take over." The voice came through clear, but what made it even more unsettling was the silence that followed. The backup wasn't just any backup. It was the same voice that James had spoken with earlier, the voice from the other end of that crucial call. The radio crackled again, louder this time, and the officers froze. The voice that came through wasn't just the backup they expected. It was the sound of someone who had just taken the power out of their hands. Sergeant Wallace, the same person James had called earlier, was now directly in charge of the situation. The realization hit the officers like a brick. They had no idea how deep this web of connections ran.